What if the greatest betrayal could lead to the deepest redemption? The late afternoon sun filtered weakly through the broken windows of the abandoned warehouse. Dust hung in the air like a quiet curtain, softening the outlines of rusted beams and cracked walls. It was here that Daniel finally stood face to face with Ray, the man who once had been like a brother to him,
And yet,
whose choices had left scars deeper than any wound of war. Ray sat slumped in the corner, shoulders trembling, his head bent low. His hands, once steady and strong, shook as if even the act of breathing had become too heavy. The silence between them was almost unbearable, filled only by the faint hum of wind pressing against the walls. Daniel's chest tightened as memories flooded back laughter around campfires. Promises whispered in the dark, the unshakable bond of trust that had carried them through impossible battles. And then, the betrayal. "Ray," Daniel said softly, his voice carrying a weight that words alone could not hold. Ray flinched, not because of the sound, but because of the name spoken with such unexpected gentleness. He lifted his face, and in his eyes was not defiance, not anger, but something far more fragile, shame. His lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Daniel stepped closer, his boots echoing faintly across the empty floor. For months he had imagined this moment, pictured what he might say, how rage might spill out, how justice might demand its due. But standing here now, with Ray trembling before him, all those imagined scenarios dissolved like smoke. Instead, what filled him was a sorrow so deep it threatened to break him. "You don't have to explain," Daniel murmured. "I just needed to see you." Shoulders shook harder. His eyes brimmed, though he quickly turned away, ashamed of being seen so vulnerable. "I failed you," he whispered hoarsely. "I failed everyone." Daniel let the silence stretch between them, not out of cruelty, but because he knew some truths could not be rushed. He lowered himself slowly to sit across from Ray, the distance between them no more than a few feet but carrying the weight of years. "When we were out there," Daniel said, his voice steady, "I used to believe nothing could break us, not the enemy, not the fear, not even death." He paused, looking at Ray with a mixture of grief and tenderness. "But life is harder than war, isn't it?" Ray nodded, unable to meet his gaze. Daniel drew in a breath, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small token, a dull piece of metal worn smooth from years of being carried close to the heart. A pendant they had exchanged long ago as a promise of brotherhood. Daniel placed it gently on the ground between them. Ray stared at it, his hand trembling as he reached forward. When his fingers brushed the cool metal, something inside him broke, not with violence, but with release. He bent forward, shoulders heaving, finally letting out the grief he had carried alone. Daniel did not move closer, did not try to quiet him. He simply stayed there, present. His silence speaking of patience, of understanding, of a bond that time and mistakes had strained but not fully destroyed. After a long while, Ray's sobs subsided. He looked up, eyes red, but there was a spark now, a faint light where only darkness had been. "Why are you here, Daniel?" he asked, voice ragged. "Because," Daniel said softly, "I couldn't let the story end with bitterness." The warehouse seemed to exhale with them. Heavy air lifted just a little, enough for both men to feel it. Ray closed his eyes, his breathing evening out, and for the first time in years, peace touched his face. Daniel rose slowly, extending a hand. Ray hesitated, then placed his own in Daniel's. Their grip was not the firm clasp of soldiers, or the desperate clutch of broken men, but something quieter, an agreement to begin again, however uncertain the path ahead might be. As they stepped out of the warehouse, the last rays of sunlight painted the horizon in gold. The world outside was still vast, still full of trials, but at that moment, both men knew they had reclaimed something greater than victory hope. The journey back to the city was silent, but it was a silence filled with unspoken understanding rather than the heavy tension that had hung between them for so long. As they walked, Daniel couldn't help but remember the first time he and Ray had met. Fresh-faced recruits thrown into the chaos of basic training. They had bonded over shared hardships, late-night conversations, and a mutual determination to prove themselves. Those memories now felt like relics from another life, preserved in amber, but forever changed by the weight of all that had happened since. Daniel glanced at Ray, noting the deep lines etched into his face, the silver threading through his hair. They had both aged far beyond their years, worn down by experiences that most people could never comprehend. As they approached the outskirts of town, Ray suddenly stopped. "I can't go back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not after everything I've done?" Daniel turned to face him, seeing the fear and self-loathing etched across Ray's features. "You can," he said firmly. "Won't be easy, but you're not alone anymore." Ray shook his head, his eyes darting nervously. "They'll never forgive me. I don't deserve forgiveness." Daniel placed a hand on Ray's shoulder, feeling the tension thrumming through his old friend's body. "Forgiveness isn't about deserving," he said gently. "It's about healing, for everyone involved." They stood there for a long moment, the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future hanging between them. Then slowly Ray nodded. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was a willingness to take the first step. As they continued walking, the familiar streets of their hometown came into view. For Daniel, it was a bittersweet homecoming. He had left this place as a boy full of dreams and returned a man carrying the weight of war and loss. But now, with Ray by his side, he felt a glimmer of something he had thought long lost the possibility of redemption. They paused at the edge of the town square, both acutely aware of the curious glances and whispered conversations their arrival was generating. News traveled fast in small communities, and the return of two long-lost sons, one a hero, the other branded a traitor, was sure to set tongues wagging. "Are you ready?" Daniel asked, his voice low and steady. Ray took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders.
"No,"
he admitted, "but I can't run anymore." Together, they stepped into the square, facing the mixture of shock, joy, and anger that greeted them. Daniel stood tall, his presence a silent challenge to anyone who might think of confronting Ray. As they moved through the crowd, could feel the tension building, the questions and accusations hanging unspoken in the air. It was Mrs. Thompson, Ray's elderly neighbor, who broke the standoff. She pushed through the crowd, her weathered face a map of conflicting emotions. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with tears in her eyes, she reached out and pulled Ray into a fierce embrace. "Welcome home, boy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. That simple act of kindness seemed to break a dam. Slowly, hesitantly, others stepped forward. There were tears, angry words, and painful silences. But there was also forgiveness, offered not easily, but with the understanding that healing could only begin when the cycle of blame was broken. As the sun set on that extraordinary day, Daniel and Ray found themselves sitting on the porch of Daniel's childhood home. The weight of the past still hung heavy between them, but now it was tempered by a fragile hope for the future. "What happens now?" Ray asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Daniel looked out at the familiar streets, now bathed in the soft glow of twilight. "We rebuild," he said simply, "one day at a time." As night fell, bringing with it a blanket of stars, two men who had once been brothers in arms began the long, difficult process of becoming brothers once more. Their story was far from over, but for the first time in years, they faced the future not alone, but together.